The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Paul.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Do we have Carl with us?
He was driving in.
He's in his office.
Okay, Carl, you're on mute. FYI, we're not hearing you.
All right, everybody. See, it's 9 o'clock, so we will get started. Welcome. This is the continuation of our July 2020 meeting. As some of you probably are aware and were with us last week, we started on the 15th. We are going to complete our agenda today. And just a quick overview of the agenda. We're going to receive an update today on the I-405 SR 167 Express Toll Lane Low Income Tolling Study. We will get an update on the Puget Sound Gateway Program. We also will get an overview on the performance of our toll facilities, and we will have a presentation on general social equity considerations. At this time, I would call on us all to introduce ourselves. I'm Jerry Litt, Chair of the Transportation Commission. And Debbie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, Debbie Young, Commissioner from San Juan County.
Shiv?
Shiv Batra, Commissioner from King County.
Roy?
Roy Jennings from Clark County, and I serve as the Vice Chair.
Kelly?
Good morning. I'm Kelly Fuka, Commissioner from Spokane County.
And Jim?
Good morning, Jim Restucci from Yakima County.
And Hester?
Hi, Hester Sarabrin, Commissioner from King County.
Our ex officio members will also introduce themselves. I don't know if they're on yet, but we have with us Roger Millar. Roger? Roger may be joining us a little later. He is Secretary of Transportation. Debbie Driver from the Governor's Office.
She's not with us yet.
Okay, well, she is an ex officio member as well and will be joining us later. So with that, we can get started on our first, staff, you might as well introduce yourselves too. Sorry, Rima.
Good morning. This is Rima Griffith, Executive Director from Olympia.
Paul Parker, Deputy Director, also from Olympia.
Tamara.
This is Tamara Jones, Senior Policy Analyst in Tacoma, and Carl is with us and in the office and having problems logging on. but Carl will be with us shortly, who is our fiscal analyst.
Great, thank you. And with that, we will go to our first agenda item. We have the I-5405 SR-167 toll lane, low income tolling study. And the speakers can introduce themselves. We have Gabor, and I'm not even going to mess with your last name, Gabor. And Brent Baker, the Senior Vice President of WSP USA, Catherine Larson, Principal Consultant. And get this right. I'm going to have to change some lighting here. Shanwen Lin, economist from WSP as well. Gabor is with economic forecasting from WSP, and Brent Baker also is from WSP. So the order I have you in, that would put Gabor up first. And this time we will go dark and just the speakers will be up. So if you want to turn your cameras off. Commissioners.
Good morning, actually, this is Brent Baker and I'll be introducing it here for WSP. Is Carl on yet by chance?
Not
He is
yet.
not. He's trying. He's trying. Doreen, can you
Carl
step
had
in
some
and help
introductory
him?
remarks. I don't know, Rima, if you'd like to cover those or?
I'm sorry, Brent, I didn't catch that.
Hi, I'm now on.
Oh,
Okay.
great, Carl. Perfect timing.
Perfect timing. Now my camera will work, but let's see. Okay. First time being back here for a while. So, okay. Okay.
Carl, why don't you do the, go ahead and do your audio and introduce everyone, and then we can get your camera up.
I'll get that going. So, my name is, for the record, Carl C., Senior Financial Analyst for the Washington State Transportation Commission. Today I'm here today to introduce the low-income study, the 405-167 Express Toll Lane Low-Income Study, our mid-project update. So I will provide a brief overview of the proviso, the authorizing language, and then a brief reminder for our audience in particular of how our express toll lanes function, and then hand it over to, I believe, over to Brent Baker, WSP, to kick off the presentation by our consultant team. Next slide. So the legislature directed the Transportation Commission to undertake this study through legislation in the 2019 legislature. The final report is due in June of 2021. This study is to assess the impacts of a low income of tolling on low income drivers on our 405-167 express toll lanes, and to determine possible approaches to mitigating such impacts. Next slide. In this study will be included, and we are as you'll see, is already underway, a national scan of implemented and considered low-income tolling programs, research of existing capacities for implementing a low-income toll program for the facilities, and of existing financial and performance commitments, an assessment of low-income populations who use the 405-167 facilities, and the potential challenges and benefits of a low-income toll program. In addition, there'll be an evaluation of tolling policies, traffic performance, revenues, cost, operations, and enforcement, and a final report with recommendations to the legislature. Next slide. So as a overview, as a reminder, I know our commissioners are well aware, but of how our 405-167 express toll lanes work. The express toll lanes corridor include 2 of the 5 existing toll facilities in our state. The north end 405 express toll lanes opened in 2015 from Bellevue to Linwood, and the SR-167, formerly known as the hot lanes, now express toll lanes, opened actually in 2008 from Renton to Auburn, with a more recent southern extension opening in 2016. And importantly, by 2025, the express toll lanes will be extended on 405 from Bellevue to Renton, and from on 167 down to Puyallup, creating a one long corridor of about 50 miles for these express toll lanes. And you can see in green on the map where that express toll lane, those express toll lanes are and will be in the future. The toll rates on the express toll lanes, as they are managed lanes, as we call them, they change dynamically based on congestion, with the intent to keep traffic flowing smoothly. On 405, the rates range between 75 cents and $10, and on 167, they range between 50 cents and $9. The average toll rates on 405 are about $4.50 and about $3.90 on SR 167. So that was as of last June, recognizing we are in some different times right now. And the HOV policies, on 405, the HOV 3+ are toll-free during peak hours and 2+ during off-peak hours. And on 167, 2+ are toll-free at all times. So that's an overview of the study and of how the lanes function. Finally, just to give you a sense of where we are before I hand it off to Brent next. As you can see on this study milestones, we're at the mid-study status report by the consultants. We will follow this with this fall, coming back to the commission with likely in October, toll options and selection criteria for whittling down our options of recommendations to move forward to the legislature. We'll discuss that in October, and again, make some additional decisions about that in November and December. Then in the winter and spring, we will provide an update to the legislature and presentation of the preliminary report to the commission, and be concluding our study and providing that to the legislature by June of 2021. So with that, I will hand it off to our consultant team at WSP and their subcontractors. Brent Baker, Vice President for WSP, will kick us off and introduce the rest of the team.
Great, thanks, Carl. Greetings, I'm Brent Baker with WSP USA, based in Seattle. Today we've got an interesting and thought-provoking mid-project presentation to share with you on low-income toll program options. First, you'll be hearing from Gabor DeBrazini, our project manager for this work. Gabor will be reporting on our team's far-reaching scan of existing and considered toll equity frameworks and programs, part of our task 1. Next, he will drill deeper into our case studies of the most relevant programs that we've identified from this scan, including efforts by other agencies considering similar programs that have not yet been implemented. That's our task 2. Next, you'll hear from Catherine Larson of Larson Consulting, who will share an update of the team's workshops with local stakeholders and potential implementing parties. Followed by Sean-Wen Liu, who will present a visually illuminating geographical context to the team's preliminary mapping of various socioeconomic characteristics within the I-405 SR-167 express toll lane corridor. Finally, we'll turn it back to Gabor, who will give us a wrap up and a look ahead at what is next in the project schedule. So without further ado, if you'd advance a slide or two, one more, Gabor will take it over.
Perfect. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Brent. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to hear us out today. As mentioned, I'm Gabor DeBrazini. I'm the project manager on the WSP side. I'm an economist. I sit in the New York City office. And I'm going to talk you through what has been going on in tasks 1 and 2 of our project. So task 1 was scoped to do, as Brent mentioned, a wide sweep of research into what other agencies around the country have thought about equity in a managed lanes context, as well as what other organizations have thought about frameworks and guidebooks as to how one might implement a low-income discount program or a low-income accommodation program of some kind in a tolling context. This is research that our team at WSP has done in the past, in the last couple of years, in different contexts, including for the Transportation Research Board annual conference. And that's what this poster shown here is. This is a couple years old at this point, but this was an original sweep we did of programs that exist around the country. And some of these programs, just to give you a bit of color, include things like discounts for low-income people on either tolls or transponder costs or monthly fees. Some of them include the usage of toll revenues to fund other neighborhood programs and projects. They include allowing buses to use express lanes for free, as well as awarding toll credits to transit riders on the corridor, and 100 other slightly different approaches. And for this project, we essentially refreshed this research and did a comprehensive look at trying to understand whether there were any programs that we weren't previously aware of. And one of the ways that we did this was we conducted, with Rima and Brent's help, a survey into essentially what programs were out there that would fit this criteria. And a big part of the survey was an attempt to find either programs that were either in the process of being implemented right now, and so there wasn't much public information about them, or alternately programs that were either canceled or never implemented in the first place. And we were trying to get that understanding because we really wanted to understand where programs like this succeed and where they don't succeed. And that survey was really helpful in finding out that there are actually 5 or 6 agencies around the country that are actively considering a program like this and are actually actively having conversations like this in the present. And those are agencies that I'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of slides, but are also agencies that we intend to follow up with repeatedly over the remaining year or so of this study. So if you wouldn't mind jumping to the next slide. I wanted to acknowledge really quickly that we've had a very significant amount of help from our staff advisory group. This has included the agencies shown here, and we've been having monthly meetings with them collectively to solicit them for ideas and contacts and feedback on deliverables. And also, I think I'd be remiss not to mention that we've also had long interviews with practically every agency listed here throughout the course of Task 1 and Task 2, and they really helped us a lot in figuring out both the local contexts and the questions we should be asking. And I think their feedback is going to have sort of many traces on the deliverables we'll be sending into the Commission from Tasks 1 and 2. Which are forthcoming, and we'll be taking the shape of a long chapter that outlines everything I'm talking about in high-level detail here. So on the next slide, please. As Brett mentioned, the sweep that I described in Task 1 resulted in us selecting 4 agencies to do detailed case studies into. The 4 agencies are listed here, but I'm going to talk about them in greater detail in a couple of slides. The thing I wanted to mention sort of at a very high level here is the way that our process worked is that after we selected these 4 agencies based on the program details and rankings that we conducted in Task 1, we conducted long, in-depth interviews with all of these agencies. And in some cases, multiple interviews to really try to flesh out how their programs worked and what worked about them and what didn't work and what interesting ideas they had and what sort of lessons learned they can pass on to us. Separately, as mentioned before, there are a few agencies that are considering a program like this right now, and we've had conversations with all of them at this point, and those lessons are also going to be parsed into our deliverables from this task. And the last thing I'll mention here is throughout these tasks, we've also had longer discussions with both DSHS and King County Metro about their local implementation and verification experiences with their own low-income programs. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those lessons in a couple slides as well. So on the next slide, so these 4 case studies are going to be fleshed into a longer narrative, which hasn't happened yet. And consequently, at this point, I'm just going to share some high-level interesting kind of teasers that we've learned from these various case studies that I think you'll find interesting and hopefully will result in some good conversation. So the first program that we decided to profile is LA Metro's low-income tolling program. This is a program that has existed for a pretty significant amount of time, and it's statutorily required in California for the express lanes to have low-income mitigation. And as a result of that, LA Metro implemented a program that gives low-income users a one-time $25 toll credit and also waives a $1 monthly fee that exists in many Southern California tolling contexts on tolling accounts. They have for some time been considering increasing these benefits because they see it as having a much lower enrollment than they would expect. There are only about 3,000 users in this program, and they believe that the reason for this is that the value of the benefit is actually quite low. One interesting feature of this program is that LA Metro only verifies income and residency for this program once, and then they assume that people qualify forever for this program. This is not very common. The other programs I'll talk about, generally speaking, verify once a year or once every 2 years. But the reason that they decided to do this is because they perceive verification as being expensive for them, and the value of the program is just simply not very high. And so the cost benefit for both users and LA Metro doesn't really justify re-verifying users. And another couple interesting aspects of this program, one is that users can enroll by phone as opposed to only in person. And also their program, this is not only for low-income folks, but in general, people are allowed to load their transponders with cash at all 7-Elevens in the LA area. This is something that can be very helpful for people who, for whatever reason, have a hard time getting to the actual customer service center where they would also be allowed to load with cash, just because it can be far away from them, or their time demands are such that it doesn't make sense for them. So on the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Minnesota DOT experience. This is a program that doesn't exist yet. It has been in implementation for a couple of years, and the reason it's stuck in this strange limbo is because Minnesota DOT was for a long time under the impression that it would be allowed to enact this program, and then at sort of the 11th hour, it was found out that legislatively they were not allowed to actually enact it. And so they have spent the last couple of years attempting to break through that legislative lock. But because of that, they have done quite a bit of the legwork that we're doing right now. The way that program is structured, it would provide a $50 annual credit for low-income users. And they expect to launch this as a 3-year pilot first. And the way that verification would work is that users have to show an EBT card in person at a customer service center every year. And the one sort of interesting thing that they mentioned to us was the way in which they chose this benefit. The way that they chose the $50 benefit is they calculated what the approximate average toll is that is paid annually by a low-frequency user of the system. And that's how they came up with the $50 figure. They essentially said, okay, if we think that most of our low-income users are going to be infrequent users, and perhaps the best way to abate that is to make sure that they can use it for free whenever they need. And that was the reasoning behind it. And they chose the flat benefit approach as opposed to percentage discount or some of the other alternatives that one might consider. It is simply because it was the easiest for them to implement in their back office system, because they were able to actually just treat this as a standard transponder loading transaction at their service center. So on the next slide, Virginia DOT also runs a low-income discount scheme on some tolled tunnels in the Norfolk region. And there, the discount scheme is a tiny bit complicated. What it is that you are given a 75 cent discount per transaction after your 8th transaction in a given month. So there, the idea was to give low-income people who are regular commuters on this tunnel or regular users of this tunnel for whatever reason, work or otherwise, a break over the longer run. And one sort of nice benefit of this framing is that the average benefit for users is actually pretty high. The average of 2,000, 3,000 people enrolled is that they benefit approximately $25 a month, which is pretty significant. And a part of the reason that this program is framed as being so complicated is because of the way that it came about. This is a public-private partnership concession of a toll road, and the state was effectively granted $500,000 a year by this concession to run a low-income tolling program. And consequently, they check at the end of every calendar year how much they exceeded or were below the $500,000 allotment. And if the amount was significant, they changed the amount of the benefit. So the benefit is actually toggled from 75 cents to $1 a couple of times. It hasn't really ever gone above or below that. But that's been the mechanism they've used to sort of dial in the expense. A couple other features of this program that are sort of notable, I think. One is that even though the program is mostly run by VDOT in practice, technically speaking, decisions regarding the program are made by a steering committee made up of local businesses, local governments, local colleges, and the local Navy base. It has provided apparently a nice way to hear from the experience of the people who are actually using the tunnel. And in practice, the relationship between the steering committee and VDOT has been healthy. They have re-verification every year, but they have a feature that by all accounts doesn't seem to work super well. The feature that they have is that the enrollment is limited to a 2-week period. The issue with this is that at the end of this period, the customer service center experiences a mad rush of people trying to make the end of the enrollment window. And so they end up having to make some temporary hires to process all of the verification demands. And lastly, as a part of this program, they also dropped the EasyPass, which is their electronic toll transponder, minimum balance, a significant amount as an equity accommodation. I think at this point there's a pretty well understood sort of national consensus that the lower that you can have your toll transponder balance account, the better it is for equity purposes. And lastly, there's sort of an explicit understanding that even though the toll discount accommodation is coming from the P3 concessionaire, the actual operating costs for the program are coming from VDOT. And so they cover all of the staff and operational expenses for this program. So on the next slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about MTC. They're a tolling agency in the Bay Area in California, and this is not one of our 4 case studies, but I just wanted to share this because they I think are an interesting parallel to what's happening here with WSTC in some ways. So the MTC board recently decided to evaluate all of their projects through an equity lens. And they found out that in their evaluations, express lanes were not doing super well in these evaluations. The question of managed lanes being equitable intrinsically is a complicated one that I'm sure many of us have many feelings about. But the MTC board decided that they needed to do a little bit better than they were doing. And as a part of that, they decided that they were going to launch a low-income discount scheme as a pilot and that they were going to do it quickly. They're doing the planning for this right now, and so we can't really build out much of a case study, but we very much intend to have ongoing conversations with them. Funnily enough, analogously to WSTC in some ways and in some ways not, they also have a regional transit low-income fare scheme in their region called Clipper Start. And they are planning on taking on many of the features of that program. They're going to be using the same qualification rules, for example, to allow them to spin up a pilot pretty quickly. And they have sort of an expectation that even though they're likely to start this pilot on one of their express lanes corridors, that it's sort of relatively likely that whatever they end up doing, as long as it works, sort of eventually will end up rolling out to most or all of their regional express lanes or toll roads. So just an interesting parallel experience to keep an eye on, I think, as the study goes on. So on the next slide, I also wanted to mention that we've been having a lot of conversations with DSHS and King County Metro, primarily about implementation and verification and issues like that, which, you know, as we've seen from these case studies, is something that occupies a lot of people's minds about programs like this, and really does take a pretty significant amount of effort. In some ways, I think we are lucky in this context because DSHS has a sort of really promising system set up called the benefit verification system. It's free to use for other agencies, and what you need to input into it is a name and an identifying number. I realize it has says social security number here, but we've actually since learned that there are other identifying numbers as well, other than SSN, that would work in this context. And it returns a binary yes or no over whether a person is on a state benefit program. Most of these programs have 200% of federal poverty level as the income threshold, which is sort of relatively commonly used in the other programs we've surveyed, both locally and nationally, as a threshold for an initial qualification for a program like this. And DSHS does a significant amount of outreach for their various programs to get people who qualify enrolled and to try to get as many of the people who would qualify for these benefits to actually become aware of them. And users can generally enroll for their programs, you know, in person or on the phone or online, and it usually only takes kind of a couple of days at most. So this is something that I think we're going to continue exploring in the following tasks as to how this sort of future a set of low-income programs might end up making use of the systems that have already been built out by other state agencies. And one other thing I just wanted to mention is we've also been having conversations with King County Metro and a few other folks about Orca Lift, which is the local transit low-income discount scheme. And we've learned a lot from them as well about how they went through their implementation process and what they've learned, and how they've worked with DSHS and other entities, and they've sort of given us a lot of little details that have been really interesting. And one of those points is just noted here, which is that they mentioned that sort of by its nature, the DSHS programs generally don't capture undocumented people living in Washington, whereas some of the other methods of verification can. So that's another point that we'll want to be discussing later. You know, as I mentioned, these are some high-level details that I'm hoping are interesting and helpful. This is all going to get spun up into a completed task 1-2 chapter, which will fill out some of the other details and other interviews that we've learned that weren't included in here because they were sort of lesser relevance or importance. But we're hoping that it will shape the rest of the study and be useful for eventual implementers of the program as well. So I think with that, I'll pass it off to Catherine for the time being, who's going to talk to us about the next part of the project.
So I guess, Rima, are we taking questions now, or do you want us to give our president?
I'll defer to Jerry, but I think we typically have having presenters get through all their presentations first.
Okay, great. All right. Well, great. All right, so I'll just give a brief overview of the stakeholder workshops. We actually just wrapped these up last night, right at 5 o'clock. So the purpose of these workshops was really to meet with our potential implementers, understand their capacity to implement this type of a program. The first part of that workshop, the first workshop, was actually to have Gabor talk about all of the great stuff that he's learned in tasks 1 and 2. And then we had a series of 4 workshops, participation from WashDOT, DSHS, King County Metro, the Transportation Commission staff. More than 20 stakeholders participated in these workshops, and we got some really, really good information from them. Next slide, please. So here's a list of a couple of the questions that we asked our stakeholders, but essentially what we were really trying to understand was, what is their capacity to be able to support this type of a program, and what processes and procedures did they already have in place that might be able to be used in a potential program like this in Washington State. Next slide. So there were some themes that came out of our workshops. Again, we had the options for verifying eligibility, as Gabor mentioned in his research. This is something that each of the agencies struggle with. As he also mentioned, we're kind of fortunate in Washington State where we have some really viable options that are already in place if we were to implement this type of a program. We went through a series of exercises where we brainstormed all sorts of opportunities for discount options, and we looked at the benefits and the challenges of each of those. And in total, we had 22 possible discounts that we explored, documenting, again, all of the benefits and the challenges, mitigation for any of those that kind of bubbled to the top. And so all of this great information is going to be used downstream for the consultant team as part of tasks 6 and 7 when they're evaluating the options for recommendation. We did also query the stakeholders and ask them if they were going to be evaluating a program like this, what criteria would they use? And so we've got that information to share as well with Gabor and the rest of the team. So again, a lot of really, really good information. We had representation from the technology side of these agencies, operations, policy and planning. So it was a well-rounded group of stakeholders, and we got some, a lot of really viable information we'll be able to use in this study. Go ahead and turn it over to Sean Nguyen.
Thank you, Catherine. So I'm glad to present you the task 5. So in order to better understand the social demographic and economic characteristics and geographical context for the ETL corridors and this low-income tolling program, so we introduced the task 5, which is a mapping exercise. This task is crucial for other upcoming tasks because it helps understand whether the low-income tolling program needs to be differentiated and customized for each ETL segment, and if there's any potential geographical restrictions on the program. In addition, this task will provide inputs for operations and revenue calculations in task 4 and 7, and these inputs include, for example, considerations for where program users might travel to or from. As I mentioned, the task is a mapping exercise. So on the next slide, I'm going to present a couple of maps. So these maps are divided into 2 sets. So the first set of maps is based on the block group level ACS 2014 to 2018 5-year data and visualize the social demographic and economic characteristics in the study area. In order to give a more meaningful visualization, we created a 10-mile buffer surrounding our study corridor. We defined this 10-mile buffer as our study area. So as you can see on this slide, this slide mapped the household poverty rate. In this map, we use the number of households under the poverty line divided by the number of households whose poverty status has been determined to get these poverty rates. As you can see from this map, some block groups in Tacoma area, Seattle area, Linwood area have high poverty rate. In addition, it's noteworthy that some block groups along our study corridor from Auburn to Renton have a highest poverty rate. Next map on the next slide is employment rate. So we use the number of unemployed population divided by the population in labor force to get this rate. As you can see again from this map, it follows pretty much the similar pattern as the household poverty map shows. In particular, some block groups in Tacoma area, Renton area, and the Linwood area have the highest employment rate. Next slide, please. So the last map of this map set is population density map. The methodology again is pretty straightforward. We use the population at each block group divided by the area of that block group. As we all expect, the Seattle area is highly populated as well as Tacoma area. Importantly, the population density of the block group along our study corridor is also high. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about our second set of maps. So which visualize the data provided by the stakeholders. This set of map is based on the zip code data, so you may find the map is less granular than the first set. Okay, so on this slide is about basic food client density. The basic food program helps people with low income make ends meet by providing monthly benefits to buy food. This data is provided by the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services. So we use the number of clients as of March 2020 divided by the population in each zip code. As you can see from the map, the pattern is very similar to the household poverty map. Tacoma area, Seattle area, Linwood area has the highest density again. On the next slide is Auckland Leave, the registration density. As Gabor mentioned, Auckland Leave, the program provides discounted rides for county residents who meet income guidelines. This data is provided by the King County. As you can see from the map, the zip code in the Seattle area has the highest density. So the next two slides are about toll transactions for Interstate 405 and State Road 167. So we developed a transaction per person index. This index is created by using the toll transaction data from June 2019 to December 2019, divided by the population in zip code. And we then apply a normalization factor to make this index range from 0 to 1, with 1 being the zip code, which has the highest number of transactions per person. As you can see from the map for Interstate 405, the zip code surrounding the interstate has a relatively higher transaction density. Next slide, please. And the same pattern applies to the State Road 167. As you can see, the zip code surrounding the state road has a relatively higher transaction density. So that's pretty much about the task 5. Let me hand this over to Gabor to wrap up this presentation.
Thanks, Xiaowen. And I just wanted to highlight very quickly at the end where we'll be going in the next few months. So the 2 tasks that you did not hear about, 4 and 6, are ones that we are in the process of kicking off now. And task 4 is going to be looking into existing financial and operational commitments on these express toll lanes that would interplay with the program that's eventually chosen, and trying to make sure that the programs that are eventually recommended are actually feasibly implementable on these lanes without breaching other commitments that are also of high importance. And then Task 6 will actually be identifying possible program features and evaluation criteria that will help us select program features to recommend first to the Commission and then by the Commission. And these are going to be moving over the next couple of months. Also, as mentioned before, we still have some outstanding pieces of tasks 1, 2, 3, and 5 that will be making its way to the staff and the Commission over the next couple of months. The Commission is next going to be hearing from us sometime in the fall with these program options and performance measures for selection by them, and I suspect that will be an interesting conversation. So I'm happy to jump into questions at this point. Thanks everyone for the time. Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you, and we'll go to Commissioner questions here in a second. Because this continuation of the meeting, as far as the public commenting on this, you can do that either in the chat box as you see it on your screen, or you can send those questions to the Transportation Commission directly, and those questions will be answered after the meeting. So with that, any questions from the commissioners? Just jump right in.
Yeah, this is Hester. One quick question and one quick comment. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm really interested to hear more about the results and appreciate kind of the initial findings. I think I had one question, which was about the mapping and the poverty rate. Wondering what poverty rate we used and if it was aligned with that 200% FPL that we saw in the other slide.
Is the panel okay in understanding the question? Hester's sound was a little off, but Brent, I think you.
Sean when talking, but
yeah, your sound is a little breaking up. I'm so sorry. It's just yeah. Can you just repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Here, let me try changing my sound. I was wondering what the poverty rate was in the mapping, if it was consistent with the 200% FPL that we saw as kind of a standard in the other slide. Did you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, for the poverty rate, so again, we use the American Community Survey 5-year estimates. So there's like different data fields in that survey. So one field is like the number of the populations under the poverty line. So we use this number, and it divided by the total number of the population whose poverty status has been determined. So yeah, so we just use this calculation methodology to get this rate and to map it on the map, to visualize it on the map.
So the poverty line you were using was 100% of the federal poverty line, which is.
Yeah.
Thanks. And then the comment I would have is I just wanted to kind of echo the comment that was seen with the stakeholder meetings around getting end user input. I think some of the stakeholders that you talk to who actually work with, possible end users or direct service providers will be able to give good input on program ideas and on the evaluation criteria, but on the evaluation criteria in particular, trying to figure out what needs we're trying to meet before we evaluate if we're meeting them, I think obviously is really important. I know there's limited time and money, but just want to emphasize I agree with that point.
Absolutely, and I'm sorry, I just missed that point on my slide, but you're right. That was something that came up very early in workshop 1, that we needed to talk to not just the folks that are dealing with the end users, but the end users themselves. And so we're working with Carl to see if there's a way of squeezing that into one of the later tasks.
Great.
And I believe we've been working with Gabor to identify potentially as part of task 6, so that when we are providing the commissioners with some evaluation criteria, that we've had an opportunity to also vet that with some end users to support, both having their input and support that these are criteria that support what would be of value for them. So you can use that in your considerations. Also following up, Esther, I think you make a good point about the poverty map, and that we should go and update that to, or have an additional one that reflects 200% of FPL to be consistent, especially if we do continue to use that in our assessment. So we can make that adjustment as we go forward to make sure that aligns with whichever level we are choosing to put forward as our example.
Carl, can you clarify that, or somebody, can you clarify that 200% FTL reference just to make sure everybody understands what that is?
Sure, 200% of the federal poverty level is a certain income level that that's defined as if you're below that income level, either as a family or as an individual unit, depending on your circumstance, then you're considered to be in poverty for federal purposes and receiving certain benefits. 200% of the federal poverty level is twice that amount, and there's certain benefits that you're still considered to be qualified for, and it's often used as a measure for providing whether for qualified for certain benefits, such as through DSHS, and I believe the current ORCA LIFT program, low-income fare discounts for King County and other local transit agencies.
And this is Brent, as an example, the federal poverty level at the for like 4-person household in the lower 48 states is $26,200 a year. So 200% of that is $52,400 a year. So that gives you an idea of what that looks like. There is obviously a table that has it for all household sizes.
Yeah, the one other detail I'll add really quick is it does vary by the amount does vary by household size, and separately a part of the rationale for using 200% as opposed to 100% in a lot of these contexts is that the federal poverty level is a flat national figure, and so there's an understanding that in some higher cost geographies like practically all of both coasts, that just simply does not represent a reasonable definition of what poverty means, and so doubling it does really get much more at what a low-income experience is in those
Hi, this is Debbie Driver with the Governor's Office, and I do have a quick question. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I think this is really interesting information, and we look forward to the final report. Secondly, Gabor, you mentioned the Social Security number is one personal identification number, but others exist. Can you share some examples of other personal ID options that might be considered?
Thanks. Yeah, definitely. And, you know, I'll probably partially punt this to Catherine because a lot of this was coming out in the workshops. But my understanding is that the main alternative is a unique personal identifier that is used by DSHS to disperse benefits. And I think it's called a client number or something like that. Catherine, is that right?
Yeah, a client ID.
Thank you.
And Debbie, the consideration there would be, in part, does that provide for a lower level of standard for meeting certain, privacy considerations, both for the system, for the WSDOT system, but of course, how easy is that to be used by our end users, and what kind of does that provide better privacy and better sense, better perception of privacy as well for our end users too.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks, Catherine and Gabor. That was helpful.
This is Commissioner Batra. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Tolls are specific to a location, geographical location, and most of our tolling in the state of Washington are in King County. So why not use King County, the poverty level in King County, and 200% of that as opposed to 200% of the national average?
I think that's a great point, and I think this is a conversation kind of we'll continue to have in future tasks. I think very much have not decided what kind of eligibility levels to use. Honestly, I think the reason that we have kind of so focused on the 200% federal poverty level number is just because I think it will probably save whoever eventually implements this program a lot of headache to use similar or identical numbers to what's used by DSHS. And so it just felt like a natural place to begin that conversation. But yeah, I think using something King County based will certainly be a part of our conversation going forward. I think it's a good idea.
Any other questions?
Jerry, this is Rima. I have a question for Sean Nguyen. In looking at the charts that you had, first of all, the data 2014 to 2018, I recognize there's limitations on data sets, but given it's 2-year-old data and the shift that we've witnessed in the world in our economy, I'm a little bit concerned that 2-year-old data may not exactly be the most reflective, but I don't know if there's a solution to that. But my question would be kind of look at those charts between the correlations of the low income occurrence through the corridor versus the transaction index. I'm noticing on 167 that, we have a fairly high level of low income or a high level of poverty rate, but also a fairly high level, a relatively higher level of transactions. Is there going to be a way to correlate that question or that dynamic that you're having maybe higher transactions rates even though we have a higher occurrence of poverty in that stretch?
Yeah, that's actually a good point, and we're discussing this. Actually, Gabor brought it up the other day, and we are trying to. We are seeing some correlation actually, and we are trying to find a more, I would say, more detailed way to how to establish the correlation. But yeah, definitely, we see there's a association between these two, between the transaction and poverty. Yes.
And Rima, what you bring up also raises some interesting questions for what it might cost to implement and operate such a program if, in fact, we've got a lot of sort of high frequency users that are also low income.
Right.
So we'll be exploring that in our work in Task 5.
Thank you.
Okay, additional questions? I see in the chat box, it says we have a question, but I don't see a text. since we have a few minutes, if there is a question there that somebody can see, maybe
Yeah.
we can address that now.
Yeah, Jerry, I can do that. We have a question from Maria Frost asking, could you please elaborate on the neighborhood programs and projects that some states allow toll revenues to be spent on? What are those programs, and has this been an effective use of toll revenue from the state's perspective?
Sure, absolutely. So I can't entirely speak from the state's perspective, but the programs I'm alluding to, there are really three of them. And if you reach out to me, I'm happy to kind of share more information. But the three programs are in Virginia, LA, and Minneapolis. And the most dramatic one is along the I-66 corridor in Virginia, and there they use all of their net revenues. So this is after toll revenues, after maintenance and debt service and operations costs, and they use it to fund projects within, I think it's 5 miles of the I-66 corridor, it might be 10, I forget what the exact number is. And generally speaking, they use it to explicitly fund non-driving projects. So their sort of story there is that they think that the congestion is primarily, which is what's allowing them to raise the toll revenue, is primarily caused by there not being reasonable alternatives to get from the suburbs into Washington, D.C. And so they fund bus routes that use the express lanes. They fund bike parking. They fund pedestrian improvements. They don't really fund transit because they don't quite have enough money for it. Well, they don't. I mean, rail transit because they don't really have enough money for that. But they also fund car shares and some ITS solutions that fund that sort of distribute information about bike shares and things like that. So that has been pretty dramatic in terms of the amount of money they're able to disperse. I think the amount has been on the order of $20 million a year, which is obviously goes quite a long way when you're talking about these smaller community mobility projects. So that seems to have, from a local perspective, worked pretty well. In LA, the amount of money being dispersed is a little bit smaller, but the mode of thinking is relatively similar. A lot of that funding goes toward kind of biking improvements and safety improvements and pedestrian improvements. There they do fund some roadway work, I think, but the bulk of the projects are multimodal. And the Minneapolis program is the best example of a smaller agency doing this. They generally are sort of in the sub $2 million a year range in terms of what they're able to fund, and all of that funding goes toward funding bus routes that use the express lanes. But the Virginia program, I think, is sort of the most dramatic example where they've been able to seemingly get a lot done just from having one express lanes corridor. So I think it's an interesting example. And in all three examples, the authorization comes from a state legislative level. In all places, these programs were actually legislatively required in all three cases, actually, as a condition for allowing the express lanes to be constructed in the first place. So it was a part of that political process.
Here in Washington, to add to what Gawar said, I would say here in Washington, we recognize that use of funds for those purposes, particularly if they were from toll revenue, would likely require legislative authorization, certainly direction from them to approve of such use of funds, as we don't currently use toll revenues in that way. So we recognize that there's some both political and actual restrictions in law that would potentially make those not viable here in Washington State, but important for us to consider them and potentially propose them, but if put forward with clear distinctions between what is currently allowed under current law versus what might be a possibility if the legislature wanted to consider alternatives or broaden that scope.
Great, thank you, guys. Any other questions? No, great presentation. Thank you for being here this morning, and we'll be in touch, it looks like. So thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll move to our third agenda item. We are joined today by Alan Hoffman, Founding Director and Principal Planner for the Center for Advanced Urban Visioning. He is the co-author of Pricing Roads, Advancing Equity, and he is going to discuss with us today how potential efficiencies of the road pricing can solve several problems at once, including addressing systemic inequities. So thank you for being here, Alan, and we look forward to your presentation.
There we go. Thank you very much. And let me go over here to share my screen. Can you all hear that? Can you all hear me well, and can you see everything?
We can. Thank you.
Okay. Good, because there we go. Trying to figure this out. Perfect. Okay, I will be speaking and sharing with you the perspective, having been the co-author of Transform's guide toolkit to equity and road tolling projects, Pricing Roads, Advancing Equity, and also in my work as a advisor right now, working with the WSP team, advising the Oregon Department of Transportation in developing an equity framework and for their tolling project. So I'm going to be addressing 5 topics today. I'm going to go pretty fast and cover some things in more depth than others. First, just a brief discussion of equity issues and their importance here. Second, I want to talk about framing and how you frame equity in tolling. Third, I want to share with you the equity framework we developed and some of its important points. Fourth, and I think of incredible importance, I want to share some institutional issues with moving forward with equity in tolling and other transportation-related issues. And finally, share just a few thoughts about equity in a post-COVID world, assuming at some point we will be post-COVID and not eternally within COVID. So with that, let's talk about equity. And the problem we have is that inequities are baked into our systems, and not just our transportation systems, but a variety of them. We can look at the history of urban development and transportation development with everything from redlining, how highway construction generally targeted neighborhoods and communities that were populated by historically marginalized communities, the effects of quote unquote urban renewal, and even today people's access to opportunities, as well as disparate health and other outcomes that we're seeing in part because of the transportation system, or the transportation system plays a role in. But there's another issue, and I hope you'll forgive me for doing this, but I do have to point out something very interesting to talk about equity. You've got a white, cisgendered, heterosexual, Ivy-educated male with a very strong sense of privilege. When talking about equity, we really need to be opening up and hearing voices that you traditionally don't hear, particularly for those who have experienced what it's like living as a member of a marginalized community. That much said, I do want to share what I have learned in the process of working on these issues. So the first thing I've learned is the extreme importance of how you frame an issue. And framing becomes, I believe, the determinant in whether people oppose or support some of the things that we're trying to do. To illustrate this, I'm going to tell you a quick story about these 3 monks. And these 3 monks shared a love of smoking, as you can see here. They would smoke all the time, but they gradually began to wonder if they were not supposed to be doing that, or should they be in prayer more, or even more important, if they could smoke while they were praying, because that's how much they love to smoke. So they, 2 of them decided that they would ask their superiors in the monastery, that's it, in the monastery, whether it was permissible for them to smoke while they were saying their prayers. And they got back together the next day, and the first monk says to the second, "So how did it go for you?" And the second goes, "Oh, it didn't go well. I was given penance and told to wear a hair shirt, and was really reprimanded for that. How about with you?" And the first monk said, "Well, it went great. My superior patted me on the head and said, he said, this is a sign I'm really progressing, and thank you." So the second monk got a little curious and said, "Wait a second, that's completely different than what happened to me. What exactly did you ask your superior?" And the first one said, well, naturally, I asked him if it was permissible to pray while smoking. And in that little story, you see the difference. If you frame it as smoke while praying, it doesn't sound so good. If you frame it as pray while smoking, that's good. That's a sign that you're on the right path. And I think it's that way too when we're talking about road pricing, particularly from an equity lens. The question that you're really asking is, what are you paying for when you pay a toll? The way we have framed it is we're saying that you're paying to use the road, in which case you'll often see people saying, I already pay taxes to use the road, or you're creating Lexus lanes, or this is inequitable. But a reframing, so for example, when I was in grad school, and I don't even want to say how long ago that was, and learned about the Singapore road congestion project, they framed it not as you're paying a toll to drive into central Singapore, you're paying other people not to use the road or to not use the road. And it's that reframing, you're not paying to use the road, you're paying others not to use the road, using the toll revenues, in the case of Singapore, to extend rail transit, to flood the streets with buses at super high frequencies, and to provide people with viable alternatives so that those who absolutely needed to drive could do so, but those who had other options could choose those other options at lower cost and at no penalty to their time. Another way to understand the reframing issue and how it relates to equity and tolling issues is to look at some of the writings of Professor Michael Manville at UCLA. He suggests that we need to flip the scenarios. What do I mean by that? What he means is imagine the opposite of what we have today. Now, what's the opposite of today? Would be obviously a tolled regimen. And here's what happens. First, drivers pay to use the roads. But as a result of the tolling, congestion is far lower. Now, interesting, one of the presenters earlier mentioned the MTC in San Francisco. In their study of what to do to manage traffic in the future, they found that by far, tolling and expressways achieve the greatest improvement in transportation of all of the initiatives they looked at. So congestion is far lower. Pollution and greenhouse gases are far lower. Transit is faster because it's not stuck in traffic, and it's more frequent because the less time spent in traffic, the more service hours you can put into increasing frequencies and extending services. And you probably have in place discount programs for low-income commuters to mitigate the impact of having to pay for those who can't afford it but need to get to their jobs. So if that is the opposite we have of today, and that were what we had, that was what was on the ground, and someone said, hey, you know what, we ought to replace that with completely free roads, would you make that switch? So sure, both the rich and the poor drive supposedly for free, but instead of paying with their money, they're paying with their time, and actually also with some of their money. The rich end up driving much more than the poor. Buses would be much slower, stuck in traffic, and in many cases, routes wouldn't be viable. Pollution and greenhouse gases would increase somewhat significantly. Pollution impacts would fall heavily on the poor, particularly those who live adjacent to freeway corridors. And there would be fewer revenues available for mitigation, for equity, and frankly, for just even taking care of the transportation system as it is. So if we had the system we're talking about today, we probably wouldn't want to go back to the system we actually have today because the outcomes are negative. So as Professor Manville notes, the normalcy of the situation that we have today, the fact that we take it for granted, prevents us from thinking of its fairness. So he says, look at the fairness of pricing. How fair can we make pricing regimens versus the fairness of free roads that tend to favor the wealthy, that tend to favor the automobile, and that punish the people who have to live near them or rely on public transit, he asked the question, what form of unfairness can we best deal with? Can we mitigate? And it's in flipping these frames that we can get a much better picture of what we can accomplish and how we want to accomplish it. So a third way to think of the framing and what I would consider some of the important things is, even though, and I understand through the NEPA process, we're constantly thinking in terms of mitigation of harms. But if you're going to apply an equity lens to transportation and tolling through that equity lens, we have to go beyond just mitigation of harms and start looking at structural change. What structural changes will restore equity and balance to our transportation system so that we are not constantly imposing externalities, which are costs generated by the system that fall disproportionately on those who are least able to pay them, particularly the public health costs, the cost of not being able to access jobs, the costs of having to operate an automobile. That once we deal with these structural issues, that is a far more important thing than just mitigation. So with that, working with my colleague Stuart Cohen, we developed a guidebook, a report toolkit on how to use tolling to advance the equity of a transportation system. So not just how do we mitigate the negatives, but really how can tolling be an avenue to improve the equity of the system. And I'm sure many of you have seen the document. I recognize some of you contributed your thoughts to it, and I do appreciate that. The key proposition underlying our work was that structural inequity in our transportation system may be remedied in part by effective, equitable road pricing. Now, the key terms here is structural inequities that are built into the very nature of the system. Second, we're talking about a transportation system, and a system is more than just roads or freeways or automobiles. It includes transit, bicycling, pedestrian, shared vehicles, the entire way that people get from wherever they are to wherever they're trying to get to. In part means that there's no magic bullet or remedy to all of the equity issues that have built up from decades and decades and decades of regulations, planning, laws, and policies. But this at least can make a contribution in part. And the way is by focusing on what is effective and what is equitable in road pricing. So if we do that, road pricing plus smart investment strategies together could and should lead to more frequent and affordable public transit, and I would argue faster public transit, safer pedestrian and bicycle routes so that people have other options. Interesting aside, in Bogota, Colombia, when they developed their network of bikeways, they developed the largest network of bicycle infrastructure in Latin America. They saw biking increase 5 times in their city, from 0.8% of trips to 4.0% of trips. And what they found was that, especially among low-income residents of Bogota and the surrounding areas, the first piece of transportation vehicle, so the first vehicle they would buy would be a bicycle, because that gave them the freedom to go where they wanted to, when they wanted to, with the infrastructure that would support them doing that. Third, it leads to improved health outcomes for environmental justice communities with the right set of strategies, and hopefully has a mechanism or means of discounts and exemptions or other ways for low-income households to be able to use the facilities as they are needed for them to pursue whatever opportunities, employment, healthcare that they may have. When we talk about equitable outcomes, what we're really talking about are greater affordability of the system, their ability to get around, improved access to opportunities, and improvements in community health. And I'll show you now the steps that we have to get them. The 5 steps that we had identified to an equitable road pricing program. First is identifying who, identifying what we're talking about, identifying where. Sounds simple, but so often we don't spend a lot of attention up front doing this. So who is going to be effective? What are going to be the impacts? Where are these people located? Where are they going? Second, we need to define the outcome and performance indicators that will tell us how, what the results are as we measure our different alternatives. Third, we have to determine the benefits and the burdens of road tolling on the different populations we're looking at. The costs or benefits, and the costs or burdens and the benefits are that are involved. Fourth, you choose the programs that advance transportation equity. Now, at this point, what we found in looking at best practices around the world is that's not the end of the path. Rather, all of the best programs then go through additional levels of iteration. Having chosen a set of programs, they go back and ask, have we looked at everyone who may be impacted? Have we developed the right measures here? Have we measured the right benefits and burdens? And then and only then, after several iterations, do they then adopt and implement their program. And then the 5th step, one that again isn't always done very well, is providing accountable feedback and evaluation. Mechanisms in place to ensure that you are achieving the objectives for which you launched the program. So when we look at that first step, identifying who, what, and where, questions that really should guide that are we looking at the right populations of people? So yes, people who are experiencing low income, people who we traditionally use the term minority, but also what about seniors, limited English speakers, persons with disability, immigrants, refugees, small businesses that may be impacted, even meal delivery services. All of these need to be identified. And the question asked, should priority be given to certain populations and why? A related question is, are we missing anyone? Has anyone fallen through the cracks? Are the criteria we've used to identify populations fair? So these kinds of reflective questions are important to ensuring that we're not forgetting anyone. So, interestingly enough, in the earlier discussion, it was talking about people earning twice the federal poverty level. And that has been a fairly standard level used at tolling programs. Are there alternative or additional pricing strategies that we're not looking at right now? We should probably identify those as well, because at some point they may want to reemerge. And very important issue, have people from vulnerable communities provided input on the measures that you're using, on the strategies and the goals. And by saying providing input, I don't just mean a public meeting in which people talk. I mean, how there are mechanisms so that that input gets into where the decisions are made and representatives of those communities are present as decisions are made. Is there a scope and budget provided to do multiple iterations? The second, third, fourth, or fifth iterations generally are much smaller budget-wise than the first and take not nearly as much time, but they still need to be accounted for in the work that you're doing. And having the community identify the key priorities is critical for the community to see whether or not those priorities are being addressed through the program. Now, there's all kinds of great examples of this. One of the examples that we really got a lot from was Vancouver, British Columbia. You have your own Vancouver and Washington State, which wanted to look at a range of tolling or payment options in order to fund their transportation system. So they identified the broadest range of potential policy options and conducted a very course level evaluation saying, what what can we say about each of these in terms of their ability to reduce congestion, to improve the equity of the transportation system, to attract and support private investment, and meet a range of other important considerations that they identified in the process. And from that, they identified two options that they wanted to take forward for further study. In the case of Vancouver, distance-based charging and congestion point charging. And it was through that process to identify what generates revenue, what is fair, what has the impact. Another important consideration is ensuring that your project boundaries cover everyone who's affected. What we have found in some of these studies is that some people travel from beyond the project boundaries or to locations beyond the project boundaries, and yet they are definitely affected. Somehow there needs to be a way to incorporate them, which means creating an extended impact area to capture everywhere where people are impacted, as well as on the more micro side, the direct impact area, typically people who live adjacent to facilities who will be directly impacted by noise, air pollution, traffic, or any of the other direct impacts of the transportation system. It's important to identify the location of critical services, ones that are taken advantage of by people in historically marginalized communities, such as where are people shopping? Where are they going for medical care? What about schools? What about the religious institutions? And where do they go for recreation? All of these need to be incorporated into the analysis. Once the who, what, and where are determined, in step 2, we can begin to define the indicators that will tell us whether we're achieving our equity and our performance goals. Now, when we talk about equity, there's a lot of definitions of equity out there. One that I particularly like is that equity is when a person's, shall we say, their ethnicity, their sex, their gender, their anything does not predict the outcome. That outcomes are independent of who a person is. I thought that's a very nice one. But when we look practically at equity, there's two kinds of equity that are especially important in road tolling and other transportation projects. There's what we call process equity and outcome equity. They're both important, and what I have seen is that often or too often, a project will latch onto one or the other and kind of pay short shrift to the other form of equity, but both are vital and both are necessary. Process equity is the process transparent and participatory. And the key measure you're looking at is the participation of the people who will be impacted by the project. Or do they have a seat at the table? Are their views and the community views helping drive the project? So process-wise, that's terribly important. But what's also important are the outcomes or the results. And there's 3 kinds of outcomes which are vital to achieving equity. There's number 1, the affordability of the system as a result of a tolling project. The second is what it does to people's access to opportunity, whether that's employment, whether it's healthcare, education, visiting friends, visiting family, going to church or other religious institutions. And third, community health. What impacts does it have on community health? Air pollution and its impacts on asthma, the ability of people to walk or bicycle, all of these things. So these 4 key areas of equity, full participation, affordability, access to opportunity, and community health are what really need to be driving our thinking about road tolling and other transportation projects. In order to do this, we need to understand the impacts of, for example, a tolling plan on vulnerable communities and compare that with the impacts on the general population. At the same time, we have to look at the impacts between, for vulnerable communities, with the tolling plan and with no tolling plan, and the same with the general population. So there's a lot of different levels of cross analysis that we need to do in order to better understand the impacts on equity. An interesting study, Los Angeles, with its I-10 and I-110 express lane pricing study, and they looked at quite a number of different aspects of how equitable the system was. They looked at the number of people using transponders and whether they came from the communities of concern or not, the number of percent using people in these communities using high occupancy toll lanes, the usage of lane credits, mode shift or mode choice, how the transit performed. Did the express lanes improve transit performance, reliability, and travel time? The impacts on the general purpose lanes in terms of speed, problems that people low income may have had with maintaining account balances. Sometimes they have to keep a lot of cash in a transponder, and often people at very low income levels just don't have even 25 or 40 or whatever dollars it is to have banked against using a toll. The share of time savings versus the share of tolls and transponder costs. The comparative trends, are people taking shorter trips, longer trips? Are they spending more time or less time? And how is the toll revenue being invested? What is it being used for? So and particularly, are these investments benefiting low-income commuters? So there's a whole broad range of things that people are looking at in order to determine how equitable systems are, particularly in terms of low-income commuters. So let's look a little bit at these 4 equities, as I mentioned. First, full participation. One of the issues you're looking for is how do you increase the degree of participation in the process? So at a minimal level, vulnerable communities just get a flyer or a website to go to. There may be open houses and websites, but otherwise it's really agency talking to people. At a slightly higher level of participation, the vulnerable communities are invited to provide feedback to the goals. So there may be public comments, there may be focus groups and surveys. But moving up the participation ladder, we move to a more ongoing solicitation of public concerns and aspirations. So there will be more workshops, there'll be more deliberative polling. As we continue to move up the ladder, we see partnerships formed between agencies and community groups throughout the projects, creating advisory committees, building consensus, participatory decision-making. And that's great, but the most optimal way to achieve this participation goal is by giving vulnerable communities a seat at the decision-making table. That sounds very risky, but it is how we create processes in which people feel that they are part of the process, part of the solution, and not being dictated to by an agency. So there's lots of different ways to do that, ranging from citizen juries reviewing projects, ballots, representation on decision-making groups. But the goal is always to see how far to the right we can increase public participation. We measure it by looking at things like the number of activities held, the number of meetings, the amount of the share of the project budget devoted to that. We look at the communications, which language are we communicating with the public? Are we taking advantage of media outlets that target different groups? Our work with community-based organizations, the amount of staff time devoted to that, whether in some cases there's support in funding for community-based organizations to participate in the process, to pay staff to attend meetings. The number of participants in the process coming from vulnerable communities, the responsiveness of the project to concerns raised by members of vulnerable communities, whether their priorities are in fact implemented. So all of those have to do with full participation. Now, and that is for the process equity. For outcome equity, we start with affordability. And when we look at affordability, there are different ways and different programs that are adopted. First, discounts for people in low income, discounts not just on tolls, but on transit fares. Regressiveness of tolling, we look at whether the revenues are distributed in a way that mitigates the regressiveness of tolling. The percent and change of household budget devoted to transportation costs is another measure of affordability. Looking at participants, how many are participating in discount programs? What percent of eligible people are participating? We look as well as the amount of subsidies that are coming from tolls and the total expected savings to individuals, as well as the costs of using alternative modes. When we look at the second of the outcome equities and the third equity of the fourth, access to opportunity. Well, that should say access to opportunity above. Or is it affordability? Funding, investment in other modes, percent of toll revenues used for other modes, the quality of service, such as changes in transit speed and reliability, changes in automobile travel time, service levels, improvements that are made in transit, the number of people using transit, the change in that, the number of people paying tolls versus the number of people shifting travel to lower toll periods or to alternative modes, and any change in access to jobs and other opportunities. Finally, community health. When we're looking at community health, we're looking at, among other things, how much infrastructure is built that supports community health, such as the miles of safe bicycle infrastructure, the miles of safe pedestrian infrastructure, the amount of funding that goes to improve community health, which can include the money spent on bicycle and pedestrians in target zones, the money spent on clear air buses, the number of trips that are shifted to bicycle and pedestrian, safety improvements, traffic safety, pedestrian safety, bicycle safety. What are the impacts on collision, death, and injury rates? Improvements to air quality and their impact, from example, purchasing new clean air buses. Are there reductions in particulates and other contaminants and other health benefits? With this, I highly recommend the National Cooperative Highway Research Program's toolkit on assessing the environmental justice effects of toll implementation or rate changes. It is a spectacularly good resource. It is also a very technical and difficult resource, but there is so much there that really goes directly to these issues. Now, the third step in our process is to determine benefits and burdens, which means looking at what are the scale of impacts. Now, how big are they? What are the community interest in these impacts? And what is the potential of impacts to help or hurt the target populations? And you're looking here at relative impacts compared to what they were or compared to other groups, and the absolute impacts. What are the numbers? What are the actual impacts? So with that, there's a range of questions that need to be asked in order to assess the equity of the solutions. Everything from looking at the affordability, the number and kind of alternatives, changes to travel time, impacts to transit, what traffic diversion may occur, the impacts to social cohesion, access to opportunities, access to local businesses, noise impacts, impacts on rents, and environmental impacts. It's quite a lot of things over here, but all of these are part of the process. Very interesting, one study when New York City was looking at congestion pricing, and it came up in the course of this that people, the working poor, would potentially need to pay congestion tolls. But when they looked at the whole system, for every person of the working poor who had to potentially pay the congestion toll, the number who would benefit from all of the other measures that would fund, particularly more and better and more affordable transit. I think the ratio was something like 25 or 30 to 1. So huge benefits to the population. And there are ways to mitigate the impacts on that poor person on the left. So the fourth step, choose strategies to advance transportation equity. Now, when we're doing this, there's affordability and driver assistance. There's a range of things that could be done there. There are creating greater mobility options as well as improving active transportation networks, pedestrian and bicycle. Programs for seniors and people with disabilities, and programs that will support healthier communities. Now, whether or not you can fund these from toll revenues, state by state, depending on what your constitution says, what your policies are, whether it needs to go to the legislature, but the most effective systems figure out ways to do these four things on the left. In the fifth step, providing accountable feedback and evaluation. This is really a critical step because this is how trust, it continues to be built with communities, and you set the stage for further work, further projects in a way that makes those projects go a little bit smoother, or at least you would hope. So you need to adopt a timeline for monitoring and evaluation of the results. There need to be feedback mechanisms to get this information back to the community groups, community representatives, and a way for them to share their perspectives on those results, on the evaluation. And obviously the communication of monitoring and evaluation. These become the critical things. Interesting case study in tolling, and particularly how it went through the public, was Stockholm, Sweden, which has a population of about 1.2 million. Back in 2006, they embarked on a 7-month pilot program to test congestion pricing. At the time, it was very unpopular. 2/3 of the public was against it. And still, the city leader said, oh, well, let's just do a pilot. Please, let's just do a pilot. So they did the pilot. And what they found was traffic in central Stockholm was reduced significantly. Greenhouse gas emissions were reduced significantly. And guess what? Business sales were actually up. And there were significant improvements to transit because they funded new express bus routes and increased frequencies with some of their congestion pricing revenues. So that at the end of the 7-month pilot, they had gone from 2/3 of the public against the congestion pricing program to 2/3 in favor of it, once the results were demonstrated and people's worst fears weren't realized. And that is a really impressive case study. The findings of their post-equity study found that the impacts were greater on high-income individuals, that men incidentally paid more than women, that very few drivers were consistent payers of it, but most people would pay it occasionally, and that lower transit fares had a big benefit, particularly to younger and lower income individuals. Interesting that journeys to the central areas were shorter. Transit was faster, driving wasn't congested, and a lower percentage of them were made by cars. And there were huge benefits to 18 new regional bus lines with nearly 3,000 parking spaces so people could get to and from them. The questions to ask are, if there are project funding commitments, who or what is responsible, what priority are they given, and how will follow through happen? These need to be negotiated with the community. Who gets to determine the success of a program, whether the community actually has a say in that or not, whether if you set up a pilot process, how is that going to be set up? Will there be continuous oversight, and by whom? What unresolved equity issues will be present as a result of the program? and how do you maintain continued participation of people in future projects and in the ongoing evaluation of the tolling program. So those 5 steps really bring you to a more equitable system. But I also wanted to raise here 4 institutional issues based on the experience that we've had working with equity in a number of different places in road tolling. And these are the things that may, I would say, they need to be dealt with up front if you want to have a more successful program. So the first of these is the priority. Equity must be not just a project goal, it needs to be a project priority, and it needs to be championed at the highest levels of the organizations involved. If it's not, it's all too easy for departments of transportation and other related agencies and departments to do things the way they've always done them, because that's how they do them. And there are policies and procedures, however effective they are at project delivery, they sometimes work against the interests of equity, often without people realizing it. So it's not just enough to say, go out there, equity team, and do your thing. Within the transportation commissions and departments of transportation, there needs to be people at the top championing equity, saying, how is equity being dealt with in this program? The second of the great institutional issues is something I want to attribute to a colleague of mine, Christine Moses, who's working with us in Oregon, a brilliant facilitator. And what she said is, prepare to get uncomfortable, because that's how you know you're doing equity work. There's no way to do equity work without at some point you feeling uncomfortable. A third institutional issue is depth, and understanding that what we call racism or inequity, as I pointed out in that little thing, going back to the days of redlining, urban renewal, zoning, so many things accreted over time that our policies, our procedures, even our laws lock into place inequity and racism, even when they may seem innocuous to us today or we're not paying attention to them. So we have to be prepared to get deep and really, through this process, address whatever it is that is holding people back and that is imposing externalities on people, that is hidden costs, that is favoring one group over another when it comes to benefits. And we need to really root these things out and restructure whatever we need to in order to ensure that equity is a core feature of the system. And finally, and this is another important point, that if you are working with the community, the people who are working with the community directly, the facilitators, the representatives, they need to be involved in program planning. You can't just say hire a facilitator and let them work with it, because they need to work with the Department of Transportation in order to identify what are the possibilities, what are the issues, and get that information flowing 2 ways consistently, so that you don't end up in situations where people feel at the end of a process that they've been used or it hasn't been for any positive benefit. So that is an important issue when it comes. So these are the 4 primary institutional issues. Finally, I just want to share a few comments about equity in a post-COVID world, because I was asked to address this. I know last week you heard, or 2 weeks ago, I'm sorry, on the 7th, you heard from a number of really outstanding people about what they saw as issues, particularly it seemed with transit, but also with shared rides and the whole new micromobility sector. I don't have a whole lot to add to those discussions, except to suggest a few things. Number one, COVID's not over. Any assumption that believes that we've been through it and now we're going to get better, we all know that's not necessarily the case. We're going to be with this thing for a while. And number two, yes, the impacts on transit have been huge. There's no question about that. What about transit's future? I am not sure that anyone has an answer to that, though I think we have a lot of good questions. But I want to share a couple of things that they're just food for thought. I'm going to go over them somewhat quickly, but they represent some of the things that at least I seem to understand. The first is what I call wither transit or wither transit. That is transit going to go somewhere else, or is it just going to wither away? My sense is that the future of transit is still viable. I'm just going to not do that, but it may mean rethinking transit. Some people out there are suggesting the future of transit is going to be less larger trains, more smaller vehicles. I won't necessarily say buses, because we're seeing autonomous, self-guided, what I'll call microtransit becoming commercially available. And I suspect that those cities or regions that develop an infrastructure to support smaller transit vehicles that can be more easily cleaned, disinfected, in which people don't share the space with many other people, may be a more viable way of approaching the future. And that's one thing. Second is in thinking about transit, it's about time. The real issues are about travel time, door to door. How long does it take someone to get from point A to point B? As someone who's spent a lot of his professional life working to improve transit systems, I will tell you that thinking about travel time, door-to-door time, doesn't really drive the planning process. And it really needs to, if you are to create transit investments that produce a high return on investment. So, and in thinking about time, I want to share with you something I call the Hoffman formula, which is very simple: 5 equals 40. And yes, that is, I meant that 5 equals 40. Here's what it means. For every 5 minutes you shave off of a person's one-way commute, 5 minutes, that adds up to 40 hours a year of that person's time that you have just saved them, a work week a year. Quick math, 5 minutes each way, 10 minutes a day, 5 days a week, 50 minutes, 48 work weeks a year, 40 hours. So every improvement that saves 5 minutes, you're handing that person a work week of their time back. Time is as much an equity issue as money. Shortening a person's commute is improving the equity of the system, shortening the time they need to spend to get there. Every 5 minutes is handing that person back a work week of their life to them. And finally, just as a teaser, and I'd be happy to if you ever wanted me to come back and go into much greater detail of this, I want to suggest that I think one of the things that we're seeing with COVID is the first movement towards what I call reversing the order of planning. Around the world, a lot of cities are taking advantage of COVID to close down streets or limit streets to cars, expand outdoor seating areas, create bicycle-only streets, just really reapportion the public realm away from the automobile. And this is what I call reversing the order of planning. In the traditional order of planning in the United States, here's what we do. First, we attempt to optimize the automotive system. And meaning we say, oh, okay, the majority of people getting around by automobile, so let's increase capacity. Oh my God, we have congestion, there's a poor level of service. And we keep expanding a system that continues to perform worse and worse. We then try to fit transit around the automobile. Half the time, the transit is stuck in the road with the automobile, and other times, well, we can't afford to give it its own lane or it's right with it, and we do that. So transit then has to fit around the car. Then we ask the pedestrian to kind of climb around all that, and there's great examples of that. You've all experienced that. And finally, we ask the bicycle to fit around everything, which means often, and I unfortunately had another version of this with a photo I would have loved to have shown you, of a 6-lane, 50-mile-an-hour expressway down in Southern California in Chula Vista that has a bike lane on it. You can literally see the cars, because everyone is so busy texting on their phone legally, that are halfway in the bicycle lane. So we devote some resources to biking, but we make it fit with the automobile and be around the automobile. And bicycles and automobiles don't go well together. It's just a fact. In reversing the order of planning, when we look at some of the better examples from Europe, what they do is different. The first thing they do is they optimize their transit network, because transit requires heavy infrastructure and it's expensive, and you want to place the access in the places that are densest, that have the greatest number of trips, in the hearts of destinations, not on their edges, at the front doors of major facilities, not across the parking lot. So optimizing the transit can have a massive impact on the use of transit. Then they optimize bicycle infrastructure. Take a look at a city like Amsterdam or another city like Copenhagen that make bicycle infrastructure central. And that rather than having bicycles cross streets, in many cases they have streets crossing the bikeways. So the car has to slow down, not the bicycle. Very interesting. The third thing they do is they expand the pedestrian realm, widening sidewalks, creating linear parks, other opportunities to create parks, removing some parking and creating public space, seating areas, everything that expands the pedestrian realm. In a COVID or post-COVID world, this also makes sense because outdoor activities are inherently safer than indoor activities. Creating an expanded public realm will allow people to be more social, even in a COVID environment. And after doing these three things, then they look at optimizing the automotive system. But something fascinating happens here. Once you've optimized your transit and your bicycle and your pedestrian infrastructure, the role the automobile plays shifts in the system. And you no longer build the same set of projects. Rather, you may look at targeted grade separations, the creation of lower speed grade separated roads, true expressways, not what we tend to call expressways. You do all kinds of things, but it's really focused on supporting what the automotive system does best as opposed to transit. Transit is most effective at taking you from where many people are to where many are going when many are going there. So your major employment sites, your major destinations, those are made for transit. And the automobile is perfect for taking you from where no one is to where no one is going when no one is going there. And that is why the automotive system really needs to be a lot broader, but we shouldn't be relying on it to do the things that transit can do better if it is optimized to the task. So I share that with you because I think that is the real opportunity that we have today to think about how do we optimize our transportation systems, create more equitable systems, but more effective systems. And we do that by optimizing the transit, bicycle, and pedestrian realms before we optimize the automobile system, the automotive realms. And that's our opportunity today. So I know I've covered a lot of area, and I thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. And we'll get to questions in a minute. I would like to ask first, though, if possible, how do you, and looking at the base, to build the building blocks for what you have described throughout this gets back to involvement, enabling, embracing very diverse populations. And this probably, the question goes to both urban and rural areas in developing these programs. How do we or how do we bridge the gap of distrust? It's, from my experience, heavily involved in public involvement, mostly in rural areas, we see it over and over that to get people to be involved, to sit down with those agencies and organizations that are trying to make a difference, they have to trust you to get involved. And we've been building on that distrust from the late 70s. It's only gotten worse. And I think my biggest question is to effectively bring people in. How do we earn the trust of those that we're trying to involve?
That is an excellent question. I won't pretend to have all the answers to that, but I can share you what I've seen that seems to have worked in my own experience. First is, as you say, when distrust is there, it's very hard to deal with. Given the climate we're in this country today, some distrust, I don't know that can ever be overcome. And I hate to say that, but I'm just being realistic. But I think a lot of distrust can be overcome by, number one, when leadership sits down and listens to people and lets people say what they feel and they experience and they perceive, which means you're going to hear stuff you don't want to hear. You may be called names. You're going to hear anger. It's going to be uncomfortable. And you listen and you listen and you listen. And when the people are done, you say, here's what I heard. And you let them know that you heard what they said. And then you say, how can we move forward? Or you have this concern, this concern, this concern. What about if we do this? What if we do this? Let's work together on this process so that there are mechanisms and means to ensure that your concerns are part of this process. I can recall one public meeting in which I was there as a planner who had proposed something. Community was not 100% with us, and I had one member of the panel saying that he was going to vote against it. And then I stood up and I acknowledged every thing he said, every objection he raised, not to say you're wrong, but to say, this is a real concern of yours. Let's build this into the project. Let's do this, let's do this, let's do this, and let's do this. And in 6 months, we'll build it into the actual document to the project that we're gonna come back here and ask you, we're gonna give you the ability to say yay or nay after 6 months. And he stopped and he said, okay, that's good. I feel listened to, I feel good now. All right, I'm gonna vote in favor of this. So it's that combination. It's the listening, it's the acknowledging, and it's the offer to say, how can we work through this together? It does not mean sending someone to work with the community who themselves has little or no say in the project or in the process. So does that help?
I think it helps, and it goes back to one of the basic things. When I graduated from college, the planning professor, we really didn't have a planning program back then. We were part of the geography department, but one of my planning professors started with, you plan with your community, not for them. And I think that is still true today, but it's harder to get people involved. And if they, like I said, if they don't trust you, you got to hang in there. And I've had a lot of those uncomfortable meetings too, where, you get called names, and even at one point in my career had a gun pointed at me. But, it's just so important that we need to earn the trust, and government needs to do a better job of planning with their communities rather than just for them. So others ought to weigh in, and we'll see what kind of questions we get. Any questions from the commissioners?
Hi, Jerry. This is Debbie. I have a couple questions. I really thank you for your presentation. I really like the way you talked about reframing how we think about roads, that, you know, we're paying to use the road and then we're going to use that to mitigate, to reduce the use of the roads, essentially. We have a bunch of hurdles to getting there. And I have one question for Carl, and I know we have some legislative directed hurdles, i.e. income from tolling needs to be used to expand the roads in some cases. So maybe Carl could just sort of summarize some of those hurdles. And then my question for you, Alan, is really, have you thought about sort of phased implementation of this branding, you know, where right now we've got a tolling backbone that goes up one side of our corridor, but not up the other side. Has it been successfully implemented, you know, in a patchwork manner, or do you really need to have a congestion pricing zone where everything happens at once? So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
I heard Debbie. Am I still up? I see Carl, but I'm not hearing anything.
Yeah.
Well, I could, Debbie, I heard you ask around what kind of limitations we have for use of toll revenue.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And
you don't need to go into detail. You could just sort of remind us of our various limitations.
Sure. As I partly addressed during the prior presentation, we do have limitations that's directed by the legislature on how that revenue is used. Most directly, it's currently not allowed to be used for transit, and not allowed to be used for, say, those kind of neighborhood projects, or say local streets projects that are maybe, even if they're connecting to the transit to the tolling corridor, they're not necessarily part of it as defined by the state route or the what is being covered by the tolling. So there are limitations currently on how that's used, and of course, more broadly speaking, we have limitations from the 18th Amendment between how our gas tax revenue is used, you know, solely for highway purposes as opposed for transit purposes. And so, you know, we have both the limitation on toll revenues, but also limitations on our broader revenue sources for transportation on how that's used. And so, you know, there are examples of joint ventures essentially being created with Sound Transit, providing, you know, transit funding to support some infrastructure on the express toll lanes that support their use of the lanes, and then that helps to supplement, kind of provide for some joint efforts to support transit use of those lanes. But again, that's not toll revenue supporting those type of projects. It's finding ways to work together collaboratively, in a sense, to ensure that the use of funds that are allowed can be done in a collaborative way that support each other, so that there may be some better outcomes for the public from that, you know, overall.
Thanks.
Any additional questions? Well, we're right on time. Thank you, Alan. That was an excellent presentation, and one that I'm sure we will keep close to us as we work through this, and use a lot of those excellent ideas. So thanks again. It was a very good session.
Thank you very
much. With that, we're going to take our program update. We will hear from John White with Washington State Department of Transportation and Ashley Probart from Transportation Improvement Board, who will give us an update on the Gateway program and help us start our discussion around the possible future road jurisdiction transfer related to this project. So hopefully there is Ashley. Good morning.
And can you hear me? This is John. Can you?
We can hear you, John. I don't see you at the moment. And Ashley, I think you may
don't?
need to unmute your mic.
I did. I think I'm back.
Thank you.
Okay, I tried using my, can you see? This is interesting. So my camera's not showing up. There we go. Can you see me now? And can you hear me also?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for the welcome. My name is John White. I'm the Deputy Program Administrator for the Puget Sound Gateway Program, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today and provide you an update, the Commission an update on some of the key activities on the Gateway Program. And do I have control of the slides? There we go. So today we had planned on providing a brief update on the scope and schedule for the Gateway Program. We're back with the Commission on the recommendation for expressway naming for both the 509 and 167 corridors, which is something that's been taken up by the tolling subcommittee previously. And then, as you mentioned in the intro, start to introduce a discussion on route jurisdiction transfer and have a very initial discussion on the scopes and locations of state highways, which we are anticipating turning back to local jurisdictions through the completion of the Gateway Program. So on to the next slide here. So the good news for Gateway Program was this last month here, we heard that we were the recipients, at least the anticipated recipients of an infra grant. And for those of on the Commission that have been tracking our saga through Craig Stone's previous briefings, this was our third shot, our third swing. Craig likes to use the baseball analogies on it, in pursuit of infra, and we were successful. We're waiting. We still have to pass the August 14th 60-day congressional consideration timeframe. So we're waiting till mid-August before we can have final confirmation and engage USDOT. But what we know is we have is proposed that Gateway would receive $73.6 million from USDOT. For those on the Commission that were tracking our history on this, and the February 2020 submittal to USDOT, we had requested $98.4 million. So the approximate math is we received 75% roughly of what we had asked for. And as has been mentioned, so we took a little haircut on that, but overall it's a great success. And we like to hit on some of the key points that we believe led to the success here. And the Northwest Seaport Alliance is ranking as the second largest port complex in the country for agricultural trade tonnage. The NWSA being the fourth largest container port complex in North America. And probably the fact that the warehousing and distribution centers that they rely on in South King and Pierce counties are the fourth largest in the nation. We took a somewhat different approach with this infra grant application and had a much more thorough focus on the national and international benefits of the program. And so you see that last bullet, and this is something we really stressed in this application, the amount, the number of other states across the country, the northern tier states that rely on getting their goods out to Asia and to the markets through the Northwest Seaport Alliance, and includes states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, and on to the West Coast here, California, Oregon, Idaho, etc. So I think we really try to focus on those broader partnerships and benefits, and it was successful this time. So more to come on that. But this certainly helped us with the funding gap that we had been working towards filling on the program. So maybe we can move on to the next slide. This is a slide we've used that was where we came out of the 2020 supplemental budget and what the outlook was. The program funding was $1.96 billion. As you can see, hopefully the yellow bar represents where we expected infra, and that was out in 23-25. We had tied infra to the second half of the program and what we refer to as the stage 2 contracts. Now that we've received infra earlier, that changes the outlook. The other thing I'd want to mention here on this slide is we had our initial expectations for when the local funding came in was predominantly 23-25 through 27-29. So you'll see those green blocks of local funding. They're all tied to the memorandum of understanding with our partners that captured the $130 million in local funding commitments that were required per Gateway legislation and the funding plan for the Gateway program. And so we've been successful in achieving a lot of those local commitments earlier than what's shown here coming out of the 2020 session. At the point when this slide was initially developed, we had a $70.1 million funding gap that was towards the tail end of the program. You'll also note the purple block in 25-27 that reflects the $180 million in capital funds achieved through toll revenue. And that was, again, an element of the program that was at the latter end. And that was at least our starting place, 180 million in terms of expectations. So moving on to the next slide here, you'll see, and this one's a little more complex, but I think it's a slide that you've seen before, a format you've seen before. This reflects where we're at today with the expectation that infra will be obligated somewhere around the end of this fiscal year leading into the next fiscal year. So you'll see the yellow infra blocks now showing up primarily in fiscal year 2022. Depending on our ability to get through the agreement process with the US DOT, some of it might show up towards the end of fiscal year 2021. That's something we'll just have to see how that plays out. But we again, having that federal, larger federal investment early on allows us to push out some of the Connecting Washington funds to later years. And as we get to maybe a later part of the discussion, that's going to be probably a very good thing for us. You'll also see the green blocks reflecting local funding commitments, and we've been successful in locking in both our direct partnership commitments with our partners on some of our early contracts like the Port of Seattle, City of Des Moines. We've been successful in locking those in, as well as been very successful through the PSRC and TIB grant competitions. And so with that, we've now seen some of these local funds and commitments show up earlier. And again, that allows us to defer some of the Connecting Washington money to later years, which again, given the revenue shortfalls that are going on right now as part of the pandemic, probably a good thing for the Gateway program. With this slide, you'll see a larger purple, you'll see the purple toll funding block, but then you'll see a gray hatched block right above it. And that reflects the funding gap that the Gateway program still has in our future. And that funding gap has grown a little bit here with the receipt of the infra grant, because we were almost 24, I think, $0.7 million short of what we had originally anticipated. And so that gap has grown to slightly over $90 million from the previous $70 million gap. So that's something that will have to be addressed. Our strategies at this point are, I think, being hopeful that as we recover from the pandemic, we can leverage toll revenue to maybe fill a portion of that gap, and then continue to compete in grant pursuits and potentially federal stimulus opportunities or state transportation budget opportunities. So it's something that we're very cognizant of and sensitive to. We do have some time to work on the strategies to fill that gap. This schedule that you see in front of you here shows us finishing the program by end of fiscal year 2028, and that does reflect the legislature's adoption of the acceleration plan that the Gateway had developed as part of a proviso requirement and presented to the legislature. So that had been adopted previously. I think now, in light of the revenue shortfalls in the pandemic, it raises questions on whether the accelerated plan for the program is realistic. And we'll see how that plays out going forward. Maybe we can move on to the next slide here. So a little update on the contracts and within the corridors. For those of you that are tracking the details or recall the details, in each of the two corridors, 509 and 167, we have broken out the construction into what we refer to as stage 1 contracts and stage 2 contracts. And when it comes to 509, the stage 1A contract that you see in that first line, that is a partnership with Sound Transit, and that is a $40 million element and WSDOT contribution, funding contribution to the Sound Transit's Federal Way Link Extension contract, which is the design build contract with Kiewit. And through that contract, Kiewit will be building the SR 99 bridge that is sandwiched between the Sound Transit Guideway and the lower SR 509 roadway that needs to come through. So they will be building that bridge in concert with building their Guideway, which really helps us avoid some extremely complex construction if we were to come in later and do that ourselves. We are also partnering with Sound Transit on noise walls along the western side of I-5 to ensure that the western communities there in SeaTac and Des Moines receive full noise mitigation for both rail and highway noise as part of one construction process and contract. So that's another critical element of our partnership with the Federal Way Link Extension contract. Stage 1B of 509 is the piece that builds from 24th Avenue South in SeaTac, which is the interim southern access to both downtown SeaTac and the airport. Building that segment, connecting from that point, connecting into I-5 with our new freeway-to-freeway connections, building a collector distributor system along I-5, and reconstructing the SR 516 interchange. As part of reconstructing the SR 516 interchange and improving it, we are also building a veterans connection underneath I-5, which will connect the new ramp system and collector distributor system to the veterans corridor the city of Kent has constructed from the valley and the warehouse and distribution center district up to Military Road. So we'll be making that final connection within that contract. Stage 2, and that contract right now is in procurement. We have shortlisted 3 design build teams. That's Kiewit Construction, Lane Construction, and Atkinson. They are in pursuit of that contract. We are expecting proposals to be submitted in October and per current schedule, expecting to award a contract in December of this year. That contract is somewhere in the vicinity of $300 to $350 million. Again, a design build contract. Stage 2 would then come in later and complete the final link from 24th Avenue South up to South 188th Street, where the current freeway ends on 509. So we can move on to the next slide here. For 167, again, it's the same. Oh, sorry. Maybe go back here. Go back to there. Brief update on. Let's see. Can we go back to the previous slide? There. So on 167, brief update on where we're at with that portion of the program. Again, similar situation where we have stage 1A and stage 1B contracts, and then a stage 2 later contract that will complete the connection and completion of the corridor. The SR 167 stage 1A contract is currently under construction. That builds a new 70th Avenue bridge across I-5 and a new connection over to SR 99, where there will be a roundabout. That is under construction by Atkinson, and they are right now, while there was a short pause due to establishing COVID policies and procedures, they've been back on track and recovering schedule, and are looking to have a I-5 closure to set girders across I-5 here towards the end of August. So that will be happening this summer. The roundabout is also under the early stages of construction, and we expect that contract to be substantially complete by next summer. The stage 1B contract of SR 167 builds the connection from I-5 over to the SR5, what's known as the SR 509 spur, and the connection going into downtown Tacoma. And for that contract, we are currently at least planning on issuing a request for qualifications at the end of October, and then we would have issue a request for proposals in March of next year if we maintain that schedule as budgets are developed and reconsidered here. So that's the current plan for 167. The stage 2 contract again would follow and build the piece from I-5 up to SR 161 and Meridian and Puyallup, where the current freeway ends. So we can then move to the next slide here. So expressway naming. I think everyone here on the commission is aware of the proviso language that we had in the toll bill that required us to collaborate on the consideration of naming conventions for both the SR 509 freeway section, completed freeway section, and the SR 167 completed freeway section. The proviso language actually suggested the nomenclature of using the expressway. And Craig had presented that to the tolling subcommittee earlier this year. And our understanding is that was the recommendation coming out of the toll subcommittee in April was to move forward with the expressway naming convention. We can move on to the next slide here. I think this shows the sections of 509 and 167 that where the expressway convention would apply to. And for 509, it's the connection from 188th Street down to I-5 and through 516. The tolled section of new 509 freeway. And then for 167, it's a section from again 161 and Meridian and Puyallup down to what's known as the 509 spur connecting into downtown Tacoma. Some of this, this is foreshadowing a bit of the route jurisdictional transfer discussion that's coming up next in terms of the notion of what will be the new limits for 167 and 509 once we complete these connections. But these are the segments that we are considering for the expressway naming. And when you go to the next slide, we'll recap kind of the naming conventions from the scan we did nationally in terms of conventions that other states are using. You'll see the expressway somewhere, kind of right around the middle there, and has been used amongst quite a few states. The other one that's maybe predominant, the other two that are somewhat predominant are Parkway and Turnpike. But our feeling had been expressway, if you're thinking about the intention and the benefits of the Gateway program in terms of the efficient movement of people and goods and freight through these new tolled corridors, the feeling was that expressway best captures that notion. Turnpike is certainly a much more historic convention in some of the East Coast states in particular. It goes way back, but certainly not a convention that is so present here on the West Coast, and probably doesn't really fit the purpose of Gateway and these tolled corridors that we will be completing. So that's in our discussions with the Commission and with REMA have been wanting to bring this to the full Commission and then talk about is there support to adopt this convention, and then how do we memorialize that if there is support. And maybe it's good to pause there.
Thank you. We'll wait for questions after Ashley is complete. Thanks.
Okay. So we'll move on then. So route jurisdiction transfer, and this is the big one for Gateway on the agenda today. When you look at the sections of 509 and 167 that exist today, you have the existing freeway sections, and then when they culminate, in the case of 509, it culminates at SR 518 at the boundary of Burien and SeaTac. And in the case of 167, it terminates at, again, SR 161 in Puyallup. Beyond those points, when it comes to 509, there are, I guess you'd call it, 3 to 4 distinct segments of SR 509 that are within local jurisdiction that we would be looking at turning back one way or the other. And when it comes to 167, it's predominantly the section along River Road from Puyallup down to kind of the boundary of Tacoma. And so within those turnback sections, we'd be either looking at utilizing the RJT process as defined by RCW and working with the Commission and the affected local jurisdictions as well as TIB. Or in some cases, as we get into the details here, we may have some sections where just a straight administrative process between WashDOT and the local jurisdictions could apply. And really it comes down to that third kind of line there, the definitions by RCW of 509 and 167. And I didn't include them there today. I think that's for probably our follow-on discussions to really kind of get into the assessment of those RCW definitions and probably the next follow-on conversation that we might expect to have on this subject would be to really kind of go through these discrete segments and talk about the RCW definitions and come to some type of mutual understanding and alignment on which segments would be subject to an RJT process and require a change to the existing RCW definitions, and which segments might not. And I think once we have that defined, then we at least then we have kind of the ground rules established and the processes established for each of the discrete segments. We've talked to Ashley a bit in the lead up to this briefing today, and Rima, and it's a pretty big scope here that we're talking about. When you look at it holistically, this is a lot of state highways within local jurisdictions that we'd be looking at turning back, and we don't take that lightly. I think the good thing we have going for us is that within the Gateway schedule, and again, the schedule may change a bit. We'll see how things move forward as budget, the next cycle of budget deliberations happen. But even given the current schedule, we don't need to move on all of these. There's a way to prioritize these transfers tied to, the timing of our contract, so that we can, take these on in a strategic, prioritized manner, and not, so it doesn't overburden anyone in particular, hopefully, and allows us to kind of focus on discrete segments and work through the issues with them, and then move on to other discrete segments. So that's some of our initial thinking when it comes to the basic approach. But again, I think the first thing we'll have to establish is the common understanding of which segments would apply. I do want to point out that when you look at the 509 segments that are within local jurisdiction, they're shown in orange. I probably should have called that out if it's kind of small and hard to see on people's screens. So I apologize if I didn't call that out a little bit earlier, but you can see the completed corridors shown in blue and green, and then you can see the corridors that would be turned back shown in orange. And for 509, you have a first segment that kind of starts up at the Normandy Park, Burien, SeaTac area, continues down through Des Moines. Then you have a section that is jointly signed with SR 516, and then continues jointly signed down SR 99 to Federal Way. That is not highlighted in orange because you have some other state routes that still remain. And then you have a segment down in the southern portion that is tied, and the northern portion, the timing of that is tied to the SR 509 program and projects, whereas the southern portion of the 509 turnbacks is really tied to completion of SR 167 predominantly, and the connection and the proposal to connect SR 167 down into downtown Tacoma and 705. And that would be part of the expressway naming convention discussion. And so when you're looking at this southern portion of SR 509, you have Dash Point State Park that's just located to the west of SR 99, which is located just west of I-5 there. So that's a consideration, access to the state park, and we've reviewed the RCW that speaks to that. And it's a bit, it's a bit vague in places. There's clearly state highways that connect state parks, and there's state parks that don't have direct connections to state highways. And so that's something that will be a unique consideration when it comes to that segment of 509. And then there's a southern piece of the 509 spur that connects into 705, the piece that's down there more immediate to Tacoma. And I think there's a question there whether that is just ends up being superseded by the naming convention for 167, and does 167 end up being the route designation end up being continuous from 405 down into downtown Tacoma. So that's going to be a key question that will tie into some of this discussion as well. So if we go on to the next slide here, it speaks to some of our local partners who will need to engage in this. And I think there's the one thing that you'll notice here as you review the populations from 2018 and each of the jurisdictions within both the 509 turnback areas and the 167 turnback areas. Normandy Park stands out as the sole jurisdiction that is well below the 27,500 threshold of population for having local control and responsibility for traffic control devices. So that's something that we wanted to point out here, and we'll take some, will be probably a sensitive point of discussion with Normandy Park. It's a relatively small segment of 509 that falls within the Normandy Park, but again, they are an outlier in this consideration. Some of the things that the Gateway program has done so far in looking forward to these transfers is we've looked within our preservation programs in both the Northwest region and the Olympic region. We've identified future planned preservation investments within these transfer sections, and we've done our best with each of those regions to put a placeholder on those that essentially says, please do not, remove these commitments, reprioritize them, et cetera. And as you might expect within the WSDOT right now, with the revenue shortfalls we've been facing at the front end of the pandemic here, it's caused WSDOT to have to reprioritize and reconsider the prioritization of all of our programs. But what we're trying to do here is ensure that to the best of our ability that these investments, that the preservation investments planned within each of these corridors are held and maintained, and then that correlates with the schedules that we would be envisioning these transfers to occur within. 509, the northern part of the 509 turnback area just recently had quite a bit of preservation work done. So there was some recent work done there up in that portion, but the southern portion of 509 and the River Road section of 167 have not had such recent preservation investments. The other thing that we're starting to look at, and it's a work in progress, is identifying all encumbrances or major features that are located within these segments that stand out and will have to have unique consideration. And that includes fish barriers that have not been improved, that are part of the injunction and part of the commitment to replace existing fish barriers. So we are at the front end of a process to identify existing fish barriers that still remain within these turnback sections, identify bridges and walls and major features like major stormwater features that have longer term preservation and maintenance requirements that come with them, so that we can be transparent about those as we begin to this conversation with our local partners working towards these transfers. So we're going to be identifying each one of those major features that will take specific discussion and be ready to speak to those as we begin to move towards outreach with our partners here. So that's another thing we're doing, planning forward. When it comes to the schedule for this, I mean, this is the last thing I'll say on this, and I know Ashley's got some things to share, some thoughts. We've got some breathing room in the schedule. Right now, if you recall back to one of those previous slides, under the accelerated schedule for Gateway, we were looking at opening up these new expressway segments by the end of 2028. That was under the accelerated schedule. We believe we're under, there's some potential for that acceleration to be modified and potentially go back to, we could be going back to some schedules that may look similar to the pre-accelerated schedules as the department works with the governor's office and the legislature working through the 21-23 budget development process. So we'll see how that plays out. If anything, it'll push us outward. Certainly wouldn't pull us inward or accelerate anything further. And so when you think about our time frame for the sections that would require an RJT, and even the ones that require just direct negotiation, with our partners through a non-RJT process, we think we've got some time. We would wait until see what happens coming out of 21 session here. We'd want to know we'd want to see if anything in our schedule's changing, and if so, what, and to what degree. I think we'd want to see what those outcomes were, and then base our discussions and our strategies in terms of initiating RJT processes on any changes that could come from that budget development process. So I think right now we're doing our homework, working with Rima and staff, working with Ashley and his staff, and trying to get aligned. We are having conversations with some of our local partners that are part of our partnership coordination with Gateway, and the subject does come up, as you might imagine. And we are looking for opportunities to partner with them and maybe find some win-wins. I think in some cases we're hearing things from some local jurisdictions where they might not be so opposed to this, assuming we can leave things and transfer things to them in a good state of repair and condition, and maybe not leave them with any large, future obligations that they weren't planning for. So I think we are tracking some possibility there of some win-wins as this goes forward, but more to come on that. So maybe it's best for Ashley to weigh in.
Sure. I think this is a good time. I just want to note this your presentation ran a little longer than anticipated, so we will run over into our lunch break some. Ashley, we don't want to cut you short, and there may be a couple questions.
Well, I only have 8 slides, so I think at most will probably be a couple minutes over. But okay. Well, so first of all, I'd like to thank John for his presentation. It kind of tees up what I want to talk about. But what I thought would be really helpful or instructive is to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes going back in time, if you will, to 1990, when route jurisdiction transfers became a reality. And the reason I think that's important is it kind of sets the stage for some of the things that John touched on earlier in his presentation. So just as kind of a friendly reminder, this was a big deal back in 1990. I joined Department of Transportation in 1991 in the headquarters planning office, and this was one of the cornerstones of some of the things that we were looking at. But this really started in the late 80s, early 1990, and there was legislative guidelines that said for a committee that was formed, the Route Jurisdiction Committee, we want you to take a look at the system and divide it between rural highways and urban highways, and look at a whole range of network, the network as a whole being somewhat blind to whether it's a state highway or a local jurisdiction, but what does it serve and what does that particular corridor accomplish? So I gave a couple of examples here. If it's a rural county road that say has an excess of 300,000 tons and provide 300,000 tons of freight and goes to a port, should that really remain a county road or be a state highway? Should it connect to a county seat? John had mentioned the point that there are a lot of state highways that connect to state parks. In the early 90s, that was one of the bigger cornerstones of the discussion is should or shouldn't all routes that go to a state park be a state park, or should some of them remain, say, city streets or county highways? So it was quite the laundry list, but I just wanted to pull out a couple of examples. If you could go to the next slide, please. So what happened out of that is that at the very end of all this laundry list of criteria, they said, go back and do good things, but look at the different financial impacts what's going to be added, what's going to be deleted, and what changes are there going to be to the state system, and then come back and report 6 months later in October of what does this look like. And it turned out to be quite a laundry list. My colleagues in the planning office had 6-inch 3-ring binders that we used to walk around with a hand truck because of all the additions, deletions, and what that would look like. So it was quite the intensive process, and it required about a 2-year public outreach of going to cities and counties, multiple public hearings, multiple public meetings, and significant negotiation. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So in 1993, all of that information had been packaged, so to speak, and it was in one long bill. And I started to figure out how many miles of what was transferred from cities and counties to the state and the state back and forth. I keep thinking it was like between 500 and 700 miles, but don't hang me with that number. But what I can tell you is that in the actual bill, there were 75 separate actions of new state highways being added, state highway segments being deleted or changed. And then there was a tag on because of the Federal ICE-T Act in 1991 that there was new definitions for scenic and recreational highways. And so some of the language in the original bill realigned some of our definitions in order to be consistent with and eligible for federal funding. And then as John mentioned, I think on one of his slides, it was about that time that the City Hardship Assistance Program was created, and that was for cities under 20,000 impacted by the route jurisdiction transfer. So think of the town of Kelso, for example. They inherited some former state highways, and whenever those former state highways are due to come up for resurfacing or paving, they knock on our door and say it's that time again, and they are eligible under this category of our program. So one thing I would note that it's about $1 million a year, so it's sliced fairly thinly, and every time you add another jurisdiction that's eligible, that just kind of waters that down. And typically what we see at the Transportation Improvement Board, whether it was the City Hardship Assistance Program eligible project or not, or CHAP is the acronym, they tend to just compete with our regular programs to accomplish what they need at the local level. Next slide, please. So along the history train from 1993 to 2020, from 93 to about 2009, we at the TIB made those recommendations to the legislature. And then in 2009, state law directed the commission to make that RJT recommendations to the legislature. But we at the Transportation Improvement Board have remained in a fairly strong advisory role, if you will, for the commission. And that's in part why I'm on this conference call. So looking back, and I went through the history of this, there's not a whole lot of these route jurisdiction transfers that occur. It's every couple of years. Many, if not most, have been in small scale, a couple city blocks here or there, a few miles. Greg Armstrong, if he is on the phone or on the line, he reminded me that when there was the 101 bypass in the city of Sequim, that where 101 previously went through Sequim, that was RJT'd back to the city, and TIB helped out with that in the resurfacing and reconstruction. And I can tell you, both in my career at Department of Transportation and then working for the Association of Cities for 12 years, that historically the objective has really been to be what I call win-win, win-neutral, or neutral-neutral between state and locals when these transfers occur. And so that's kind of the historical setup for it. If we could move to the next slide, please. So as John shared, this is pretty significant, and these are 2 different drafts that I received, Concept 1, Concept 2, with 3 significant areas. And I was just trying to present this to show that the scale for this is in miles, and it's also multiple jurisdictions. So this is going to require, as John mentioned, quite a bit of homework both for the department and probably quite a few briefings for you at the Transportation Commission. Next slide, please. And then John touched on this. I use slightly different nomenclature, but he mentioned encumbrances and major features. And I just wanted to remind the commission that because of the amount of miles involved, that this will take quite a bit of inventory work by the department to find out what's really there. And John already mentioned the one that I think many will high center on is the fish passage component. are there requirements there? And because of the court injunction, I'm sure that'll be one of the first check the boxes to make sure that that's addressed. And then as part of that, of course, will be if certain things do need to be brought up to standards, who will pay for it and how it will be paid for. Next slide, please. So in our kind of gut reaction of looking at this, I want to say just up front, both to Craig, who's probably drinking coffee and hanging out on the deck or something, but more so to John and the team, is that DOT should be commended for identifying this early, because this is going to take some time, and time is what's going to be required. So like I said, hats off to the department as we all work through this. The other thing I'd say is that just kind of looking at the surface from a state perspective, it really does make sense. But as John's talked about, in my mind, this is a little bit of uncharted territory, in that it's going to require multiple negotiations with multiple jurisdictions. And I think what the department's talking about of phasing this is probably going to be the most successful path forward to getting this done. And I'm pleased to hear that the message has been put out to program management at DOT to maintain current investment levels on these projects or on these corridors. And when you look at it through the lens of cities, and Jerry can probably relate to this, historically under the growth management model, if a city is planning to annex certain lands and it's adjacent to counties, there's a strong disincentive for a county, or strong incentive for the county to stop investing if they know that a city is going to take over. And it requires a lot of MOUs ahead of time to make sure that the citizens see consistent levels of service. So the other thing of practicing win-win or neutral RJT, I put this in as difficult at best before John just shared that he's getting some positive signals. And I think a lot of that does depend on the quality of the infrastructure that's received. We had talked in our pre-conference call about Normandy Park as a little bit of an outlier. And so I think they are going to be kind of the poster child of how are they taken care of or addressed. But I'd like to mention that for cities right now, and maybe it's the moment we're in, we're certainly getting calls at TIB about nervousness of how do we maintain our system in the time of COVID. And so I think we all need to be mindful of, because we are in the COVID, COVID world at the moment, everybody's a little extra sensitive on how do we pay for things. And so things that might have been routine or just negotiated, say 6 months ago or 8 months ago, are going to be a little more sensitive than they were today. And then at some point, locals will have to accept the fact that this is going to require permanent ongoing maintenance and upkeep of the new network. So I think that's just the nature of the beast as we move forward. Next slide, please. And this is kind of my last slide here that's a little bit bigger picture. And this has been triggered both by looking at the scale of the Gateway proposal and me coming before the commission, I think about 12 months ago, that it really has been 3 decades since the last route jurisdiction transfer. And we see at Transportation Improvement Board certain segments that maybe should be state highways or state highways that really should revert back to locals, scattered here and there throughout Puget Sound and throughout the state. And that's a byproduct of the Growth Management Act. We've added 2 million people. And frankly, our state and local transportation investment priorities have changed. In 1993, 1992, transit, can't get my camera right, transit, multimodal, Sound Transit wasn't even a platform at that point. Our world has changed quite a bit. So I think the Puget Sound Gateway proposal needs to be taken on its own, but I can't encourage the commission enough to maybe recommend to the legislature, maybe it's time for a reset of looking at our overall network and how it's functioning for our customers. So that's what I've got for you, and I will stop now. We're 4 minutes into lunch, but I'm happy to answer any questions, but I do want to end with 2 things. Again, commending DOT for the start of this process, because we're going to be involved for a long time. And then selfishly, congratulations to my good friend Paul Parker, who is going to be retiring soon. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Nice job. Before we ask for questions from the commission, just want to make one observation on the naming for the expressway. I think there's generally support from the commission on that, and we will be taking that up in October. Any questions for the commission or for the panelists? Excuse me. Everybody must be hungry, but.
Jerry, this is Rita, Jerry. I gotta ask a question to Ashley, and then I'm kind of curious if Ashley and John can give us a sense of schedule looking forward. So Jerry, you mentioned the October, maybe trying to put to bed the naming designation. That's an easy one. This RJT is not so much. So one question is, what do you guys kind of see looking forward in terms of major milestones? Kind of, is this going to be a 2 to 5 year process? Is it going to be quicker? And then to Ashley, if you could just maybe clarify or add a little more insight into what you meant by the reset of the RJT, and is that contemplating like kind of a bigger inventory exercise, if you will, and a reassessment of current jurisdictions across the state?
I'm going to ask John to explain what he thinks the schedule is, since they own the system. But my guess is we're probably going to be about 2 years. That'd be my guess.
I guess I would agree with you, Ashley. It's probably a minimum. Probably would not be less than that. It could be more, especially if we take a somewhat staggered approach where we prioritize things by segments. I can see that playing out then certainly for longer than 2 years. I think right now we're in the homework phase and data compilation phase, and then we'll be reaching out to you and staff to talk about our outreach plan to start to just have, I think, the initial conversations with the jurisdictions and bring to them, here's what we see the issues being, and walk through schedules and things like that, and just begin a conversation that will lead to us to probably come to a point where we will ultimately agree on what we think is the right time to initiate formal RJT processes. So I guess we've been looking at as there's a lead up to that. There's a lot of homework and a lot of early conversations that have to happen before we pull the trigger and say, yes, we're ready to go on this segment before February 1st of maybe 23, 24. We'll also have to see what the legislature, how our schedules play out, and if they change, that will influence some of this as well.
That's why, if I may, John, that's why I'm so pleased to have this conversation now in 2020, rather than you getting towards the end of the gateway and then this becoming a forced conversation rather than a methodical one. So like I said, that's why I'm so complimentary of the department on starting to work through this, because it will probably come through in phases or chunks.
Yeah. And our commitment is to stay in front of it, Ashley, and be ahead of the curve rather than find ourselves late in the game under pressure and a lot of stress.
Right. So I'll answer the second question. Rima, yours was regarding to what I called the reset or rethinking of the route jurisdiction transfer. I would share that it's for two reasons. One, it's just kind of the accumulation of what we see at TIB of certain segments that no longer function as designated in 1990. That's part of it. And so that's why I wanted to take that opportunity, at least before the commission today, to make that pitch again, like I did 12 months ago, that I believe there's time for some rethinking of the system. And then I think the other side of it is where I said state and local transportation investment priorities have changed. The legislature has redirected the department subtly year over year, that when you accumulate 30 years of subtle little adjustments to department priorities, the functional reality is some of the traditional investments that did occur in cities under 27,005 or over have shifted. And so I think maybe it's an opportunity to kind of have that conversation and make sure everybody's on the same page.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I wouldn't be surprised as you do that route jurisdiction study, you look at other economies of scale. When you look at, just looking at And thank you, by the way, for the project in Cooley City. They're starting paving today.
Good.
With that is their Pinnell Ridge Road, which leads from Moses Lake to a segment with Stratford Road into Cooley City, and a county pavement project that worked last year has become a lot different alternate route from Moses Lake to Highway 2. And we're seeing a lot more traffic on it. And an overlay that was badly needed by the county stopped at the city boundary, and the street was just as much falling apart within the city limits as it was outside. And you see those improvements, and I think the whole discussion of how you can partner even at the local level on making those improvements, and that connects to your new project that we see being completed. So, you know, I think that whole discussion will grow as you actually get into not just the route transfer, but the affordability of maintaining the system.
Right.
So with that, we will break for lunch. Thank you very much, and we'll be back at 1 o'clock.
Bye-bye.